David Miller first stumbled upon the legend of the glass children during a seemingly ordinary archival assignment in London. The museum's basement was dim, lined with rows of metal cabinets, each drawer carrying the weight of decades, secrets, and forgotten histories. Among the dusty folders, one small unassuming packet labelled Institute 47, Subjects and Observations, 1952-1961, seemed to vibrate with an almost palpable energy. Its paper was brittle, edges curled, and the typewritten sheets inside whispered a tale of shadows and vanished childhoods. He began with the observational reports. Each subject was assigned a code, G1 through G47, children between 6 and 12 years old, selected for their extraordinary cognitive abilities, exceptional memory, acute perception, and rare psychosensory responses were recorded meticulously, often in cold clinical language that barely masked the fascination and sometimes terror of the observers. Marginal notes in Cyrillic hinted at unspoken anxieties and ethical disquiet. Deviation observed, subject contained, procedure adjusted. The detachment of the text contrasted violently with the humanity of what David imagined lay behind the numbers. A diary entry from Dr. Vera Lazareva, lead investigator of the Institute, jolted him out of his professional detachment. Scribbled, in blue ink, the entry read, "I cannot reconcile what we are doing with what is human. The children are more than subjects, they are mirrors. I see my own reflection in their fear. To question is to risk removal. Silence is survival." The word mirrors lingered, heavy with implication. These children reflected not just their own terror, but the ambitions, compromises and moral compromises of those who observed them. Photographs accompanied many reports. Pale faces, wide-eyed and unnervingly alert, stared from the yellowed pages. Some smiled faintly, a fragile acknowledgement of the camera's presence. Others remained expressionless, their gazes cutting through decades to confront David directly. One image captivated him entirely. A girl of 8, hands folded in her lap, lips pressed thin, and eyes that seemed to carry centuries of sorrow. The note beside her photograph read, "Subject G12, exceptional." It matched the earlier reference. In a termination report, raising questions David could barely articulate. Hours passed unnoticed as he sifted through the archive. The documents described daily routines designed to stress, measure, and manipulate. Cognitive drills, sensory deprivation, and repeated tests were standard, yet glimpses of the children's humanity punctuated the clinical accounts. One entry noted a child, G7, humming a lullaby from memory, a song forbidden by the Institute's strict programming. The researchers documented it as an unexpected emotional response, marking it as a procedural risk. David imagined the punishment that followed and felt a tight knot form in his chest. The letters between Lazareva and her colleagues in other Eastern Bloc countries revealed tension beneath the scientific veneer. Discussions were careful, coded. "We must maintain integrity within the Council's parameters. Innovation demands sacrifice, yet the human element cannot be abandoned." Every word dripped with anxiety and unspoken terror, a negotiation between moral instinct and institutional pressure. David sensed the strain, the quiet despair of scientists bound by authority and ideology, forced to choose compliance over conscience. Drawings by the children, included in some files, were especially haunting. Whimsical sketches of cats and houses sat beside abstract depictions of looming figures and incomprehensible shapes. The researchers' annotations highlighted anxiety patterns, recurring symbols of fear, and other behavioral metrics. David lingered on these pages, tracing lines that were both innocent and ominous. Here was evidence not only of experimentation, but of imagination bending under constraint, the fragile human spirit pressed into form and evaluated as data. 1. Folder detailed experimental procedures in painful, painstaking detail. Children were exposed to simulated stressors, puzzles that tested memory beyond ordinary limits, and sensory deprivation to observe reactions. Occasionally, annotations noted anomalies, a child refusing to comply, a sudden outburst, or a tear that escaped unnoticed by the watchful eyes. These were circled, underlined, and coded. David realized the repetition of cold technical terms: non-compliant, adjusted stimulus, session terminated, was meant to erase empathy, to standardize suffering as scientific observation. By mid-afternoon, David realized he had fallen into a rhythm, reading, analyzing, hypothesizing. Yet the story refused to cohere neatly. The children's lives were fragmented, the Institute's records partial, the human experiences contained in the margins, in the unsaid, in the spaces between typewritten lines. Every report, every photograph, every diary entry layered a mosaic of fear, brilliance, curiosity, and control. The archive spoke not only of the Institute's ambition, but of the children themselves, resilient, acutely aware, and profoundly human. One folder contained incident reports. Notable among them was G12's anomaly, recorded as deviation observed, exceptional cognitive and emotional response beyond experimental parameters. The accompanying note suggested containment procedures, but left details deliberately vague. David could almost hear the footsteps in narrow corridors, the quiet, tense breathing of children, aware that they were watched, measured, and evaluated constantly. His eyes then fell on the last page, a collection of unsigned observations, entries, possibly written by multiple hands. The handwriting varied, but the message was singular and unsettling. The children are mirrors. What is reflected cannot be unseen. The glass is fragile, the eyes are windows, and yet the world must not know. The metaphor of glass, fragile yet reflective, transparent yet sharp, pressed upon him with weighty inevitability. David leaned back in his chair, the air in the archive thick, stale. He felt a strange responsibility pressing against his chest. These records were more than data. They were echoes of lives interrupted, perhaps permanently altered. Somewhere, the children had survived or perished, carried into adulthood by circumstance, or lost to the secrecy of the Institute. The archive had preserved traces, but truth remained elusive. Closing the folder reluctantly, David felt the burden of choice. Leave it untouched, a silent witness to history, or pursue the threads, trace the lives of the children, and confront the consequences of uncovering a long-buried secret. He sensed that following this story would demand courage, patience, and perhaps confrontation with uncomfortable truths that others had spent decades trying to hide. Hours turned into an entire day. David returned to the folder again and again, cross-referencing entries, connecting fragments of notes, attempting to map the Institute's hierarchy, the experiments, and the children's faint traces of individuality. He began to understand the Institute not only as a place of science, but as a machine designed to dissect innocence, ambition, and the limits of human perception. Every piece of paper was a thread, and each thread led him further into a labyrinth of suppressed histories. He imagined the corridors, the laboratories, the small, pale children moving through sterile rooms under watchful eyes. He could almost hear the faint murmur of voices, the tapping of pencils, the quiet, urgent whispers of those who witnessed and participated. He understood, with a sinking certainty, that uncovering even a fragment of what had occurred would be both revelation and reckoning. David left the archive that evening with the folder clutched to his chest. The dim light of the city outside seemed incongruous, normal, against the weight of what he had seen. Somewhere, hidden within the shadows of history, the glass children waited, and he, alone and determined, had decided to follow the faint, almost invisible trail, piece by piece, until the full story could be told, or until it consumed him entirely. The morning light filtered through the dusty blinds of David Miller's small London flat, illuminating stacks of documents, folders, and photographs he had transported from the museum archives. Each item was a fragment of the past, a silent witness to events meticulously erased from public memory. He brewed a cup of strong black coffee and returned to the folder labeled Institute 47, Subjects and Observations. The papers had a weight beyond their physical presence. They pressed against him, urging him to follow the trail that had begun decades ago. David had begun compiling the names of the researchers, cross-referencing them with public records, obituaries, and scattered academic publications. Many had vanished from public view in the early 1960s, coinciding with the abrupt disappearance of the institute itself. Dr. Vera Lazareva's name appeared intermittently, associated with neurological studies and conferences, yet no photographs or interviews existed. It was as if she had slipped between the cracks of time, leaving only her meticulously kept diary and sporadic correspondence behind. The first tangible lead came from an obscure Soviet scientific journal that had been smuggled to London in the early 1970s. In a brief footnote, Lazareva was credited with a study on child cognitive development, but the details were vague, abstract, and deeply clinical. No mention was made of the institute or the subjects. David stared at the text, sensing the careful obfuscation. The language was precise yet evasive, a coded message for those who could read between the lines. He knew the trail would not be straightforward. Secrets had been layered upon secrets, deliberately buried. He spent the next week in relentless research. Phone calls to Eastern European universities yielded little, often met with polite dismissal or confusion. Some records had been destroyed, others simply vanished. David's determination, however, was undiminished. He began to map the movements of the researchers, noting that several had emigrated to Western Europe, taking on new identities or quietly continuing their work in relative obscurity. It was in one of these tiny, overlooked threads that David found hope. A former lab assistant of Lazareva, living in a small town in Poland, might provide the first human connection to the story. The assistant, a woman named Katarzyna, was cautious at first. Her apartment was cluttered with books, papers, and faded photographs. She offered tea and listened silently as David laid out his questions. After hours of careful conversation, she began to speak of the institute, her voice low and hesitant. She described corridors that were too long, doors that led nowhere, and children whose eyes were far too old for their age. She spoke of G12, the girl who had captured David's attention in the archive. According to Katarzyna, G12 had displayed extraordinary abilities, absorbing information at a pace no child should manage, and yet she had been fragile in ways that experiments could not measure. Katarzyna handed David a small bundle of photographs. Torn from a personal notebook long ago, they depicted children at play, their laughter frozen in time, juxtaposed against the rigid formality of laboratory exercises. One image, a snapshot of G12 mid-run across a snow-dusted courtyard, captured both freedom and apprehension in a single glance. David felt a shiver. Here was the humanity he had only glimpsed in faded photographs, and it was more tangible than any document. David learned that some of the children had been dispersed after the institute was shut down. Files indicated placements with distant relatives, adoptions under new identities, or complete disappearance. No official record explained the fates of G12 or her peers. The trail was fractured, yet persistent clues suggested that some had survived, carrying the imprint of the Institute into adulthood. This realization gave David a new sense of urgency. The story was no longer historical alone. It was a puzzle of living memory and lost lives. Evening descended as David returned to his flat, photographs and notes clutched against his chest. He spread them across the table, tracing connections, marking locations, dates, and names. Each line drawn on the map of Eastern Europe felt like a step closer to the children whose lives had been controlled, observed, and, in some ways, imprisoned by the Institute. He realized the scope of what he had undertaken. This was not merely an article or a story. It was an excavation of history, morality, and memory itself. The next morning, he received an unexpected package at his door, a small, unmarked envelope containing a single sheet of paper. On it was a cryptic note: "The past does not die. It waits. Seek the north. G12 knows." There was no signature, no indication of origin. David stared at the message, heart pounding. The folder, the archive, the photographs. They had prepared him for facts and figures, but this was different. It was a whisper from the past, a beckoning into the unknown. David began making travel arrangements. He mapped locations associated with the Institute, former researchers, and potential witnesses. He knew that to follow the trail, he would need to navigate not just geography, but memory, secrecy, and the unspoken agreements of silence that had preserved the Institute's secrets. Each step carried the promise of discovery and the weight of moral responsibility. Before leaving London, he revisited Katarzyna. She added further details. Children who had been particularly exceptional were observed for patterns, tested repeatedly, for endurance, cognition, and emotional response. One child, she said, could memorize entire pages of text after a single reading. Another could identify subtle cues in human behavior that escaped even trained adults. Yet the extraordinary abilities were coupled with fragility, emotional, psychological, and sometimes physical. These were not merely experiments. They were a systematic dissection of childhood itself. David left her apartment with a sense of foreboding and determination. Each photograph, each note, each whispered memory was now part of a larger tapestry he was only beginning to understand. Somewhere out there, the glass children existed, living under names and lives that concealed the extraordinary experiences of their early years, and David had resolved to find them, to trace their paths, and to reveal as much as possible the truth of the Institute and its haunting legacy. The flat was silent that night, the documents spread across the table like scattered memories. David stared at the photographs one last time, G12's eyes catching his own in the dim lamplight. He felt the weight of responsibility pressing against him. He was not merely recounting history, he was chasing ghosts, piecing together a story that had been intentionally fractured and concealed. The trail had begun, and David knew that every step forward would draw him deeper into the shadows of a past that refused to remain buried. David Miller stepped off the train in Krakow, the crisp autumn air carrying the scent of wet leaves and the distant hum of trams. He had travelled thousands of miles from London, following breadcrumbs that led into a labyrinth of forgotten histories and partially erased memories. The journey was not just physical. Each document he had studied, each photograph he had examined, had carved a mental map of an institute and its children in his mind. He felt both anticipation and unease, aware that the path he was taking might uncover truths some had gone to great lengths to hide. Krakow was a city of layered history, cobbled streets and old stone buildings concealing stories both public and private. David's first task was to meet Katarzyna again, who had agreed to guide him to the locations associated with the former institute. She had been cautious in the beginning, but over weeks of correspondence and conversations, she had become a tentative ally. As they navigated the narrow streets toward her car, she spoke quietly of the Institute's last years. Her tone was measured, but David sensed the weight of the memories she carried. She described the sudden closure of the Institute in 1961, the dispersal of children under new identities, and the vague promises that their lives would continue in anonymity. The first stop was an abandoned building on the outskirts of a small town near the mountains. According to records, it had once housed one of the Institute's laboratories. The windows were broken, and the walls bore the graffiti of decades. Yet David could almost visualize the corridors, the echo of small footsteps, and the sterile smell that no amount of time could entirely erase. He imagined the children moving silently through these halls, their eyes always alert, their minds absorbing, calculating, adapting. G12's presence seemed tangible in that emptiness, as if the building itself remembered her. Inside, the rooms were empty, but for remnants of broken furniture and rusted filing cabinets. David found a small notebook wedged beneath a floorboard, its pages brittle with age. It contained sketches of patterns and symbols that mirrored some he had seen in the children's drawings back in the London archive. Katarzyna explained that the notebooks were part of a cognitive testing program, capturing children's attempts to process complex ideas visually. David ran his fingers over the faded ink, feeling a pulse of connection across decades between him and the anonymous child who had drawn these patterns so long ago. The journey continued northward, following faint traces in legal documents, personal letters, and the occasional eyewitness account. David visited small towns where former staff had settled, asking discreet questions in libraries, town halls, and local cafes. Often he was met with polite dismissal. Sometimes he encountered suspicion, even hostility. People remembered the Institute vaguely, if at all, and the few who did spoke in cryptic terms, as if afraid that speaking too plainly might summon consequences long past. One evening, in a dimly lit cafe in a border town, David met a former janitor of the Institute, now in his 70s, who had agreed to speak under the condition of anonymity. The man's hands trembled slightly as he recounted memories of the children, how they were extraordinary yet fragile, how the staff treated them with a mixture of clinical detachment and awe. He spoke of G12 in particular, describing her intelligence, her quiet resilience, and the way she had often defied expectations. The janitor paused, sipped his tea, and muttered almost to himself. Some of them, they carried it with them. Even when they disappeared, it never left them. You must understand, the children were not just subjects. They were the future, and we were unworthy guardians. David left the cafe with a mixture of exhilaration and dread. Every account, every scrap of memory, brought him closer to understanding the Institute and its children, but also deeper into a web of secrecy and unresolved trauma. He felt the weight of responsibility pressing upon him, the need to document, to record, and to respect the lives that had been manipulated and observed without consent. The northern journey led him into colder climates, snow beginning to dust, the streets and rooftops as November approached. Each village, each abandoned building, each faded sign carried echoes of the past. David carried with him the photographs and documents, cross-referencing every detail, noting discrepancies, and piecing together the fragmentary narrative of the glass children. He realized that while the Institute had tried to erase its traces, memory persisted in the smallest of details, in drawings, letters, and the recollections of those who had been there. On a particularly cold evening, David arrived at a remote village where records suggested one of the children had been placed with distant relatives. The house was small, its windows frosted over, and an old woman tended a faint garden outside. David's heart raced. This could be a chance to connect directly to the legacy of the Institute. With a polite knock and hesitant introduction, he explained his research, leaving out specific details that might alarm her. The woman listened quietly, her eyes betraying a flicker of recognition when he mentioned the year 1961. She did not speak immediately, and David realized the weight of decades of silence. Then, slowly, she began to recount a story, fragmented, hesitant but unmistakably connected to the children he sought. She described the extraordinary aptitude of some children, their ability to memorize text verbatim, their subtle awareness of human behavior, their uncanny capacity for observation beyond what seemed possible. Yet, alongside these gifts came fragility. The woman spoke of nightmares, sudden breakdowns, and persistent anxiety that had followed some into adulthood. David listened intently, noting how the psychological and emotional cost of the Institute's experiments extended far beyond the laboratory. For hours she recounted incidents, small glimpses of the children's lives after dispersal, their adjustments, to families unaware of their past, their quiet, often unnoticed brilliance. G12, she revealed, had often resisted standard educational methods, her mind constantly seeking patterns and information, which sometimes resulted in isolation from peers. Yet there were moments of play, fleeting laughter, and resilience that shone through the heavy shadow of memory. David took meticulous notes, knowing that the subtleties of these recollections were as important as any document he had found. The narrative of the glass children was forming, a tapestry of extraordinary abilities intertwined with trauma, resilience, and survival. Each story, each memory, added depth and humanity to the fragments he had collected from archives and photographs. As night fell, David understood that the journey had only just begun. The trail of the glass children stretched across borders, through time and memory, entwined with lives that had been shaped and scarred by the Institute. He felt both the thrill of discovery and the burden of responsibility, knowing that the story he was uncovering was not merely history, it was a living testament to resilience, survival, and the human cost of secrecy. And somewhere, beyond the snow and silence, the children awaited, carrying within them the echoes of a past the world had worked so hard to forget. David returned to his inn exhausted but determined, aware that the following days would demand more courage, patience, and meticulous attention. Each step forward was a delicate balance of inquiry and sensitivity. The shadows of the past were long, and the children's experiences were not to be treated lightly. He resolved that no detail, no matter how small, would be ignored, for each held a fragment of truth critical to piecing together the story of the glass children, their trials, and their extraordinary lives. The morning was grey, the mist curling around the spires of the small northern town as David Miller stepped into the worn streets, his breath visible in the cold air. He had left the relative warmth of Krakow behind, moving further into regions where the Institute's presence had once been most concentrated. Each step felt heavier, laden with the responsibility of pursuing a story that had been deliberately obscured for decades. He carried the photographs, notes, and fragments of memory like a torch, illuminating paths most had hoped would remain dark. David's first destination was an archive in a provincial town hall, a building that had seen better days. The archivist, an elderly man with a suspicious eye, was initially reluctant to grant access. After careful explanation and assurances, the records were revealed. Old administrative files, birth registries, adoption papers, and correspondence between government, departments and the Institute. Here at last, David found traces of the children after the Institute's closure. Names had been changed, identities altered, yet subtle anomalies indicated who had been subjected to extraordinary oversight and placement. The entries described the dispersal of the children, some placed with distant relatives, others in orphanages or under government care, each carefully monitored. One file hinted at an exceptional subject, G12, placed with a family several towns over, and the notation included, "Exceptional aptitude noted, requires supervision and protection." The bureaucratic language was cold, but David sensed the undercurrent of unease. Those who had handled the children knew they were dealing with remarkable minds, fragile yet uncommonly perceptive. As he delved further, David uncovered letters exchanged between former researchers, suggesting disagreements over ethical concerns. Some argued for greater oversight to protect the children. Others insisted that data collection must continue under any circumstances. One particularly chilling memo described a proposed experiment to test the limits of sensory perception under isolation conditions, annotated with the word "approved." David's stomach tightened. These were not theoretical discussions. They were instructions, executed with precision and without consent. By late afternoon he travelled to a remote village mentioned in one of the adoption papers. The landscape was stark, fields of frost stretching to distant hills. He knocked on the door of a modest cottage, greeted by a middle-aged man who listened intently as David explained his research, careful not to overwhelm him. The man, whose name was Tomasz, had been a caretaker to one of the Institute's former children. Slowly, he revealed the challenges. Extraordinary intelligence paired with social isolation, memories too vivid and strange to share fully with anyone, abilities that made ordinary life difficult, and a sense of being watched, even long after. The Institute had closed. Tomasz described G12's peculiar habits, the ability to anticipate patterns, recall events with perfect accuracy, and an intuition about people that bordered on preternatural. Yet alongside these gifts were anxiety, nightmares, and a recurring need for solitude. The man's account was punctuated by pauses and long silences, as if the weight of what he was recounting pressed heavily on both of them. David noted each detail, aware that these human stories carried more significance than any document or photograph ever could. Tomasz also recounted the stories of other children, many of whom had struggled to integrate into ordinary life. Some had become extraordinarily skilled in mathematics, language, or art, yet suffered profound emotional disconnection. Others had wandered through different countries, identities fluid and fractured, their pasts known only to themselves. David realized that the scope of the Institute's impact extended far beyond immediate experiments. It had shaped destinies, creating both brilliance and burden in ways few could comprehend. Night fell, and David set up a small workspace in the village inn. He cross-referenced Tomasz's accounts with the archival material, mapping locations, dates, and connections between subjects. He realized that the pattern of observation, relocation, and continued surveillance had left indelible marks on the children. Their resilience, the subtle ways they had adapted and survived, was remarkable. Yet the shadows of the past, fear, manipulation, and control remained embedded in their lives. David began to sense that he was not alone in his search. On more than one occasion he noticed figures lingering at a distance, glances that seemed deliberate yet fleeting. Was it coincidence, or were there others, former colleagues, government agents, or perhaps even descendants of the Institute staff, monitoring his progress? The thought added urgency and a quiet tension to his investigation. The story of the Glass Children was alive, and he was navigating a web of secrecy and caution that spanned decades. In the dim light of his temporary room, David pored over letters, photographs, and notes, slowly piecing together the puzzle. He imagined the children themselves, their lives fractured yet persistent, each carrying traces of brilliance and trauma. The more he uncovered, the more he realized that the Institute's experiments had created echoes that could not be erased. Patterns of thought, heightened perception, emotional scars, and a subtle but unbreakable bond between those who had endured it. Over the next several days, David visited multiple villages, each revealing fragments of the children's later lives. He encountered teachers, neighbors, and distant relatives who offered glimpses of unique talents, unusual behaviors, and moments of brilliance. Yet beneath each story lay traces of tension and isolation. Children who struggled to relate to peers, adults haunted by memories too sharp to share, lives shaped by experiences deliberately hidden from the world. In one particularly isolated town, David found a former caregiver who spoke of a child who had developed a system of codes and patterns to communicate internally, avoiding any detection by the adults who oversaw them. The child had invented private games, methods to document events, mentally, and ways to preserve autonomy in a life largely dictated by others. David realized the resilience of these children was profound. They had survived extraordinary circumstances, yet the trauma remained, hidden beneath layers of coping mechanisms and extraordinary intellect. By the end of the week, David had amassed more than enough material for a comprehensive understanding of the Institute's post-closure impact. He felt both awe and sorrow, awe for the ingenuity and survival of the children, sorrow for the lives disrupted, the innocence lost, and the ethical violations that had remained unchecked. His research had evolved from an academic pursuit to a deeply personal responsibility, to document, to understand, and ultimately to bear witness to the legacy of the Glass Children. As he packed his notes and photographs for the next leg of the journey, David looked out over the frost-covered landscape. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the children continued their lives, carrying within them the indelible marks of the past. And David knew that the coming chapters of his investigation would uncover even darker shadows, deeper secrets, and the unimaginable resilience that had allowed the Glass Children to endure what the world could barely comprehend. David Miller left the northern village with a sense of anticipation tinged with unease. The accounts of the children, their remarkable abilities intertwined with profound trauma, weighed heavily on his mind. Each interview, each document added layers to the mosaic of the Glass Children, but there were gaps, fractures he was determined to fill. He traveled to a city that had once been a hub for scientific research in the region, where many of the Institute's staff had been reassigned after its closure. The city was a labyrinth of narrow streets and crumbling facades, its history hidden in shadows and forgotten archives. David arranged meetings with surviving researchers, now elderly and cautious, some of whom reluctantly agreed to speak under conditions of anonymity. He visited a retired neurologist who had overseen experimental procedures, a man whose hands trembled when recalling the work they had done. The neurologist spoke in halting phrases, revealing the nature of the experiments: isolation chambers, sensory deprivation, and advanced cognitive testing pushed to the limits of human endurance. "We sought knowledge," he said quietly, "but perhaps we lost sight of humanity." Documents recovered from the city archives were chilling. Session logs detailed experiments on G12 and other subjects, their responses to extended observation, problem-solving under duress, and exposure to controlled fear stimuli. Notes in the margins, often in hurried handwriting, hinted at frustration, moral hesitation, and sometimes doubt among the researchers. Some children had been noted as non-compliant, their reactions marked as anomalies requiring further study. David felt a knot tighten in his chest. The documents were clinical, yet the implications were horrifying. In the evenings, he sifted through personal journals left behind by institute staff, fragments of a hidden narrative. One diary described a child who had created secret codes to communicate with others without detection. Another chronicled a boy who had memorized entire textbooks and recited them in private rooms to avoid scrutiny. Amid these achievements, there were records of breakdowns, silent tears, and whispered fears. The children's ingenuity had been both a defense mechanism and a testament to their resilience, yet it had not shielded them from manipulation and observation. One particularly striking account came from a former caretaker, now residing in a modest apartment. He spoke of G12 with reverence, describing her ability to perceive intentions, remember minute details, and predict outcomes with astonishing accuracy. Yet, alongside these gifts were persistent anxiety, nightmares, and moments of withdrawal, so intense that she became nearly unreachable. The caretaker paused frequently, his gaze distant, as if he could still see her small figure moving through the corridors of the institute. David realized that these memories were living ghosts, resonating decades later in those who had cared for or observed the children. David's investigation led him to letters exchanged between researchers that revealed conflicting ideologies. Some advocated for the ethical treatment and protection of the children, while others prioritized data collection above all else. Discussions of experimental procedures were clinical yet disturbing, often including notes about pushing limits, recording reactions, and documenting behaviors that would now be considered deeply unethical. These revelations underscored the moral complexity surrounding the Institute. Brilliant minds committed to discovery, yet blind to the human cost. By the end of several days, David had mapped multiple post-institute trajectories of the children. Some had been absorbed into ordinary society, their talents concealed, their past hidden. Others had carried the Institute's imprint into adulthood, excelling in fields requiring extraordinary cognition, yet struggling with emotional connections and personal identity. Each story added a layer of humanity to the otherwise clinical narrative that had dominated the archival material. The more he uncovered, the more he sensed the Institute's lingering influence. Even decades later, those connected to it, whether children, caretakers, or former staff, exhibited traces of its presence in memory, behavior, and perception. David felt the weight of responsibility not only to document, but also to honor these experiences. The story of the glass children was no longer abstract. It was intensely real, embedded in human lives that had survived, adapted, and carried forward echoes of what had been endured. The deeper David delved, the more he encountered traces of unspeakable acts. He discovered references to solitary confinement periods lasting days, children forced to remain in near-total darkness, and tasks designed to provoke extreme stress. Annotations suggested monitoring of psychological and physiological responses to fear, hunger, and isolation. One log noted that G12 had demonstrated acute awareness and resilience, but the repeated exposure to these conditions left her increasingly withdrawn. David's heart pounded as he read each line. The brilliance of these children had been harnessed, observed, and manipulated to the brink. In the evenings, he began sketching timelines of the children's experiences, tracing each intervention, experiment, and transfer between locations. The patterns were both fascinating and horrifying, revealing a systematic attempt to quantify, predict, and in some cases exploit extraordinary abilities. The human cost, however, was stark. Emotional fragility, long-lasting anxiety, and the deep imprint of fear had become as much a part of their cognitive makeup as the talents the researchers admired. By the week's end, David had accumulated a comprehensive, harrowing picture of the Institute's experiments. He realized that the true story of the glass children was not just a tale of intelligence or curiosity. It was a chronicle of human endurance, ethical collapse, and the persistence of the spirit against manipulation. The children had survived, yet the echoes of the Institute's interventions had become inseparable from their identities. David knew that presenting this story demanded not only factual accuracy, but profound empathy, a recognition of both brilliance and suffering that had been inseparably intertwined in their lives. As he prepared to leave the city for the next phase of his journey, David felt the weight of history pressing upon him. The glass children were no longer abstract subjects. They were living, breathing witnesses to the consequences of unchecked ambition and secrecy. His task was clear: to document, to understand, and to ensure that the extraordinary resilience and the hidden suffering of these children were brought into light, acknowledging the full spectrum of their experiences and confronting the moral shadows left behind by the Institute. David Miller awoke to a cold grey dawn in the outskirts of a small northern town, where snow had begun to dust the rooftops and the air carried the crisp scent of winter. Each step of his journey had brought him closer to understanding the breadth of the Institute's operations and the enduring impact on the children known as the glass children. But he knew that the most significant revelations were still ahead. The trail led to remote villages, abandoned facilities, and hidden archives, places that held not just records, but the living testimonies of those who had endured the Institute's influence. He began his day at a small, dimly lit municipal archive, where records of adoption, transfers, and occasional correspondence between Institute staff and local authorities had been kept. Many documents had been deliberately redacted or removed, yet David found fragments, handwritten notes, unofficial logs and sketches that suggested continued observation of certain subjects long after the Institute had been officially dissolved. Among these, G12's case stood out. References to exceptional aptitude, cognitive assessments, and sporadic monitoring over several years. Her brilliance was repeatedly noted, as well as a marked emotional fragility that required careful attention from caregivers. As the day wore on, David traveled to a remote cottage where a former caretaker, now elderly and reserved, agreed to speak at length. He described children who had displayed extraordinary memory, heightened perception, and analytical skills far beyond their years. Yet these gifts had come at a profound cost: recurring nightmares, heightened anxiety, and social withdrawal. He recounted G12 in particular, noting her ability to perceive intentions and detect subtle patterns in behavior, but also her tendency to isolate herself, retreating into silent contemplation or meticulous mental exercises that no one could see. David listened with rapt attention, taking extensive notes. He asked questions cautiously, aware that probing too deeply could unsettle someone reliving decades-old trauma. The caretaker revealed incidents of children who had invented private communication systems, hidden codes, and intricate patterns to maintain autonomy and connection with one another. These acts of ingenuity had been necessary for survival in an environment dominated by observation and control. Later, David visited a dilapidated structure on the outskirts of the village, once a satellite facility used for specialized observation. Broken furniture, rusted instruments, and fragments of filing cabinets bore silent witness to a history that had been meticulously hidden. Among the debris, David found notebooks containing abstract patterns, exercises, and notes documenting the children's responses to various stimuli. These were not merely academic experiments. They were trials designed to push the limits of human cognition, observation, and emotional endurance. As evening approached, David realized the significance of the patterns emerging from multiple sources. The children had been subjected to a system that meticulously quantified their abilities, pushing boundaries while maintaining a veneer of care and supervision. What emerged from the records, the interviews, and the artifacts was both astonishing and harrowing. Children capable of extraordinary feats of memory and perception, but also carrying profound psychological scars. The caretaker offered a photograph, worn at the edges, depicting G12 alongside other children in a courtyard. Their expressions captured a mixture of innocence, apprehension, and latent understanding beyond their years. David studied it for several minutes, feeling the weight of history pressing down. These were the faces of the human subjects whose lives had been dissected, documented, and manipulated, yet who had endured and adapted in ways the researchers could never have fully anticipated. Night fell, and David returned to his temporary lodging, exhausted yet determined. He spread out his materials, notes, photographs, and sketches, and began to assemble a comprehensive narrative of the glass children's experiences. The story was now far more than a historical investigation. It was a moral reckoning. Each fragment of information, each testimony, illuminated the human cost of the Institute's ambitions. David understood that telling this story required both precision and compassion, a recognition of brilliance and suffering intertwined. Over the next days, David expanded his inquiry, visiting multiple towns, libraries, and private homes. He discovered letters hidden in attics, diaries tucked behind loose floorboards, and photographs concealed in personal collections. Each new piece revealed more about the children's lives after the Institute's closure. One child, he learned, had become a renowned linguist, capable of absorbing multiple languages within months, yet struggled with social interactions. Another had become a prodigy in mathematics, but their isolation had left them unable to form lasting personal relationships. David realized that the legacy of the Institute was a dual-edged sword, gifts intertwined inseparably with burdens. He also began to identify a network of individuals who had attempted to support the children, teachers, distant relatives, and occasional former staff, many acting quietly and without recognition. These allies had provided guidance, emotional support, and understanding in the absence of formal oversight. Their testimonies added nuance to the narrative. The Institute had created extraordinary minds, but it had also necessitated extraordinary care to ensure survival outside its walls. The psychological depth of the children's experiences became increasingly evident. David read letters in which adults who had been children at the Institute described recurring flashbacks, struggles with trust, and an acute awareness of subtle cues in their environment. Some expressed guilt for surviving when others had not, while others recounted a compulsion to excel, driven by years of observation and measurement. G12, it seemed, embodied these contradictions, an exceptional mind constantly negotiating between extraordinary cognition and profound emotional vulnerability. As winter deepened, David organized his findings, constructing timelines, mapping connections, and charting the post-Institute trajectories of each child. He realized the Institute's reach extended beyond its physical existence, leaving marks on families, communities, and the individual lives of the children themselves. The ethical implications weighed heavily on him. The pursuit of knowledge had come at immense personal cost, yet these children had endured, adapted, and in some cases transcended their circumstances. By the end of the week, David had amassed a collection of interviews, documents, and artifacts that formed a comprehensive picture of the glass children. He understood that the culmination of his work would require Not only factual accuracy, but a careful narrative structure to convey both the brilliance and suffering of these lives. He was documenting a story of resilience, human ingenuity, and the moral complexities inherent in the pursuit of knowledge at the expense of innocence. David prepared for the next stage of his journey, where he hoped to meet surviving children or their immediate descendants. Each step forward carried the weight of responsibility to honor the lives of those who had been observed, manipulated, and, in many ways, forgotten. He understood that revealing the full scope of the Institute's influence was not merely an act of historical research. It was a testament to the endurance of the human spirit, the capacity for adaptation, and the enduring consequences of decisions made long before these children had learned to navigate the world for themselves. David Miller entered the final phase of his journey with a mixture of exhaustion, anticipation, and solemn responsibility. The winter had deepened, snow blanketing the northern countryside in silence. Each village he traversed carried the weight of decades-old secrets. The faces, names, and stories of the glass children lingered in his mind, guiding each step toward the culmination of his investigation. His first stop was a small town where records indicated G12 had spent her adolescence. Under the care of distant relatives, the house was modest, with frost creeping along the windowsills, and an old woman tending a garden that seemed to defy the harsh climate. She welcomed him cautiously, her eyes reflecting recognition when he mentioned the institute and the year of its closure. David explained his work with care, aware that he was treading into memories both painful and sacred. The woman recounted stories of G12's childhood, her brilliance, and her extraordinary observational skills. Yet she also spoke of the child's solitude, her retreat into mental exercises, and the ways in which she coped with memories she could not share. The caretaker's accounts had suggested resilience. Here, David witnessed firsthand the complexity of that resilience. G12 had adapted, survived, and built a life. But the scars of observation and manipulation remained, subtle yet indelible. David continued his investigation, meeting other former children, now adults, each with unique talents and equally unique struggles. One was a mathematician whose cognitive skills allowed him to solve problems in ways others could not imagine, but social interactions left him anxious and wary. Another had become a linguist, capable of mastering multiple languages with incredible speed, yet haunted by recurring flashbacks of the Institute's routines. Every account reinforced the duality of their lives, extraordinary abilities intertwined with emotional fragility. In quiet moments, David pored over the archival materials, photographs and journals he had collected. He mapped connections, cross-referenced interviews, and constructed a narrative that illuminated both the brilliance and suffering of the glass children. Letters revealed strategies the children had devised to communicate and maintain autonomy. Sketches documented exercises and cognitive challenges, and photographs captured moments of play, concentration, and subtle defiance. The Institute's influence was undeniable, yet the children had exercised agency within constraints that were often invisible to those who had observed them. One afternoon, David visited a long-abandoned facility that had once served as an experimental wing of the Institute. Broken furniture, rusted equipment, and scattered papers testified to a past carefully hidden from public scrutiny. Among the remnants, he found records detailing experimental procedures, observations, and evaluations of the children's responses under various conditions. The documentation revealed a chilling combination of scientific rigor and ethical neglect, precise, methodical recording of human reactions without consideration for their well-being. David's hands shook as he examined the pages, understanding the full scope of what the children had endured. Even as he catalogued evidence, David sensed the living presence of the past. in small villages, in whispered stories, in the quiet resilience of those who had survived. The legacy of the Institute persisted. The children had carried their experiences into adulthood, shaping their identities, relationships, and careers. Some had struggled in silence, others had found ways to channel their abilities, and a few had vanished into obscurity, leaving behind traces only perceptible to those who knew what to look for. Over the next several days, David expanded his inquiry, visiting more remote locations, meeting surviving children or their descendants, and uncovering further layers of their post-institute lives. Each story revealed extraordinary intellect and skill, coupled with emotional complexities that could not be ignored. One former child, now an accomplished chess grandmaster, recounted hours of mental training and solitary games devised to strengthen memory and strategy, yet admitted that forming friendships had always been a struggle, complicated by years of isolation and observation. Another had become a painter, their canvases filled with geometric patterns and coded symbols, reflecting a mind trained to perceive and encode the world in ways ordinary individuals could not understand. David also discovered the extent to which some children had sought to reclaim autonomy over their identities. Letters, journals, and oral testimonies revealed acts of quiet defiance, secret networks of communication, and the establishment of personal routines that allowed them to survive psychologically and emotionally. These acts, though small and often private, were monumental in their significance. They demonstrated resilience, creativity, and the capacity for self-determination despite the shadow of systematic control. As he compiled these materials, David began to see a pattern emerging. The Institute had created an extraordinary cohort of individuals whose abilities could have transformed numerous fields, but at a staggering personal cost. The ethical violations, the psychological scars, and the emotional consequences were as significant as the talents nurtured under duress. Each life story he collected added depth to the narrative, showing the tension between brilliance and vulnerability, autonomy and imposed structure, resilience and trauma. The more David delved, the more he realized that these stories were not just about survival or intellect. They were about identity. Many of the children, now adults, struggled with the sense of self, constantly negotiating between the person shaped by the Institute and the person they wished to be. G12 in particular carried the imprint of years of observation. Her analytical mind and extraordinary intuition were inseparable from the anxiety and introspection that had grown alongside them. Others had sought therapy, meditation, or artistic expression to process the lingering effects, their methods of coping as varied as their talents. By the end of his journey, David had amassed a vast archive of documents, photographs, testimonies, and artifacts. He had walked the paths once navigated by the children, witnessed their resilience firsthand, and pieced together decades of fragmented history. The glass children had survived, adapted, and in many ways transcended the manipulation imposed upon them, yet their stories carried the indelible marks of the past. Sitting by the window of his final lodging, watching the snow fall silently over the village, David reflected on the entirety of his investigation. The story he had uncovered was not simply one of scientific curiosity or historical record. It was a moral reckoning, an exploration of human resilience and ethical responsibility. He understood that the lives of the glass children were testaments to the extraordinary capacities of human intellect and the profound consequences of neglecting humanity in the pursuit of knowledge. He thought of the children's triumphs, their hidden moments of joy, the small acts of resistance, and the human connections they had fostered despite the Institute's attempts to isolate them. These details gave him hope and a deeper understanding of their strength. He realized that documenting these stories was also an act of justice, a way to restore dignity to lives that had been treated as experiments. David envisioned the publication of his findings, aware that the narrative would reach a wide audience, and perhaps provoke reflection on ethical responsibility in research. But more importantly, it would honor the lives of those who had been silenced for decades. Each chapter, each account, and each photograph would serve as a testament to their resilience, brilliance, and humanity. As he prepared to depart the village, David felt a profound sense of closure, tempered by the weight of responsibility. He had uncovered truths that had remained hidden for decades, and in doing so, had borne witness to lives of extraordinary complexity. The glass children, once subjects of observation and manipulation, had emerged as resilient, brilliant, and profoundly human. Their stories would endure, a testament to survival, intelligence, and the enduring power of the human spirit. The journey had ended, but the legacy of the glass children would continue to resonate, offering lessons of caution, admiration, and empathy for generations to come. And as David stepped into the cold morning, carrying the weight and honor of these revelations, he understood that the story would live on, not only in the pages he would write, but in the lives and memories of the children themselves, who had turned their shadows into light. Elena had learned early that the world often moved too quickly, too carelessly for her to keep pace. As a child within the Institute, she had been noted for her exceptional spatial reasoning and strategic insight, capable of calculating sequences and predicting outcomes with uncanny accuracy. The Institute had observed her with meticulous precision, logging every success, every hesitation, every glance, and every tiny facial movement. Each calculation, each choice, each instinctive decision was recorded as data, valuable for analysis, yet deeply personal and invasive. Those early years had taught her vigilance, the necessity of reading subtle cues, and the weight of knowing that observation was constant, unyielding, and invisible. Her early interactions with other children were shaped by this environment. Friendships were rare, often transactional, and fraught with suspicion. Elena learned to navigate social hierarchies with acute awareness. A misstep could result in reprimand or loss of privilege, while subtle manipulation or concealment of true feelings could ensure safety and relative autonomy. She became adept at reading expressions, detecting lies, and predicting intentions, skills that would later define her as much as her analytical mind. Yet this acumen came at a cost. She internalized a sense of perpetual vigilance, a quiet isolation from her peers, and an unspoken anxiety that lingered even when the observers were no longer present. Now, in her early 30s, Elena lived in a small apartment in a bustling city. The hum of life beyond her window fascinated her and simultaneously exhausted her. Her apartment was meticulously organized, every object in its precise place, every routine timed and measured. She had developed rituals that provided both comfort and a sense of control. Morning sketches of abstract patterns mapping the city's rhythms, hours of detailed observation, and late-night reflections on the nuances of human behavior she had encountered during the day. These sketches were not merely art, they were a language, a system she had invented to process the chaos of the world around her, a framework for understanding movement, strategy, and human interaction. Work offered structure, but not connection. Elena had become a consultant in urban planning, her talents allowing her to model traffic flows, pedestrian patterns, and architectural usage with remarkable precision. She often arrived at work before anyone else, reviewing data, simulating scenarios, and planning contingencies with the same rigor she had learned at the Institute. Colleagues admired her brilliance, but often found her distant, almost impervious to casual conversation. Elena, in turn, observed them carefully, noting gestures, tones, and inconsistencies. Every interaction was analyzed, mapped, and processed. This constant mental labor left her exhausted, yet she valued it as a safeguard, a mechanism for navigating a world she had been trained to see through the lens of strategy and observation. Relationships were even more complex. Elena had learned early that trust was conditional, fleeting, and often manipulated. In the Institute, alliances were fragile, often temporary, and children were encouraged to compete even in subtle ways, whether for attention, validation, or access to resources. That vigilance had become ingrained. Romantic relationships were rare, always tentative, and shadowed by an internal dialogue that questioned motives, consistency, and authenticity. Friendships existed in theory, but deep emotional intimacy remained. A territory she approached cautiously, like an expert crossing a frozen lake with uncertain ice. Each misstep carried potential consequences, each revelation risked exposure, and even decades later, the habit of calculating outcomes before engagement persisted. Yet despite these challenges, Elena carried a quiet pride in her survival. She had outlasted the Institute, maintained autonomy over her mind, and translated her abilities into forms the world could recognize, even if it could not fully understand. She had navigated an environment designed to reduce her to a subject of observation, but in doing so, she had honed skills few could comprehend: acute awareness, predictive cognition, pattern recognition, and resilience. Her evenings were long and meditative, filled with careful reflection, journaling, and a growing awareness of the ways her childhood had shaped not only her skills, but her identity. She had learned to navigate fear, expectation, and observation, transforming them into tools rather than chains. There were, of course, shadows that never fully lifted. Certain memories intruded unexpectedly: a cold observation room, the meticulous recording of every response, the silent pressure to perform. Nightmares sometimes revisited her, vivid and detailed, often involving sequences she could not immediately decode. Yet her mind processed them with relentless precision. Sleep was both a refuge and a battlefield. The subconscious worked tirelessly to solve patterns and scenarios, replaying incidents from decades ago. These episodes, while distressing, also provided insight. Elena could analyze behavior, anticipate reactions, and deconstruct problems that had once been abstract or overwhelming. The Institute's imprint was indelible, yet she had repurposed it, shaping her mind into a uniquely powerful instrument. Even her leisure reflected this duality. Elena had few hobbies outside of structured observation, but those she pursued were both reflective and analytical. Chess, abstract puzzles, and architectural modeling became forms of meditation, exercises in control and foresight. She attended art exhibitions not for socialization, but to study patterns of color, human movement, and spatial relationships. Every encounter, every observation became data, stored not in a laboratory notebook, but in the intricate mental maps. She constantly refined. Her apartment, her routines, her very consciousness had become a lattice of strategy, insight, and survival. Through all this, Eleanor harbored a subtle sense of triumph. She had become a strategist of life itself, able to anticipate challenges, model outcomes, and navigate the complexity of human systems. The Institute had trained her in observation, but she had learned discretion. It had imposed evaluation, but she had developed autonomy. She had turned constraint into mastery, anxiety into awareness, and vigilance into foresight. In the delicate balance between observation and freedom, prediction and choice, she had discovered her most enduring strength: the capacity to endure, adapt, and exert influence without surrendering herself. Yet, beneath the veneer of control, a quiet longing persisted. She wished for connection that was genuine and unmeasured, for companionship unshadowed by calculation, for a world in which her intellect was matched by empathy and mutual understanding. These desires were often suppressed, analyzed, and approached with caution, but they were present, a reminder that even the most disciplined mind carried the echoes of the human heart. Elena's journey, therefore, was not merely one of survival or success. It was a continuous negotiation between brilliance and vulnerability, independence and intimacy, logic and emotion, memory and hope. Julian had always been fascinated by patterns. As a child at the Institute, his mind had absorbed sequences of numbers and mathematical relationships as naturally as breathing. He could solve complex equations in seconds, anticipate the trajectory of events, and detect anomalies invisible to others. Yet alongside this brilliance lay an ever-present tension, the constant awareness of being watched, evaluated, and measured. Every step, every decision, even every fleeting thought, was potentially recorded. Julian learned early that mastery came not only from talent, but from careful self-regulation, from concealing fear and doubt beneath layers of composure. Now, in his late 30s, Julian lived in a high-rise apartment overlooking the city skyline. He worked as a quantitative analyst, his abilities perfectly suited to modeling financial systems, detecting irregularities, and predicting market behavior. The analytical rigor of his work mirrored the disciplined exercises of his childhood. Sequences, patterns, probabilities. Each morning he arrived early at his office, running simulations and checking models with meticulous precision. Yet, despite the professional recognition he received, Julian struggled with personal connection. Conversations often felt unpredictable and fraught with hidden motives, a vestige of the vigilance instilled in him by years of observation. Romantic relationships had been particularly difficult. Julian craved companionship, but found himself calculating trust, timing, and emotional reciprocity with the precision of a mathematician analyzing a theorem. He was aware that his brilliance could intimidate or alienate, so he often withdrew from potential intimacy. Friendships existed at a superficial level, structured around shared interests or professional collaboration, but emotional vulnerability remained elusive. Even in solitude, Julian's mind never ceased to work, constantly running simulations of social interaction, predicting reactions, and mentally rehearsing responses to hypothetical scenarios. The psychological echoes of the Institute were persistent. Nightmares often returned, filled with numbers and sequences that dissolved into abstract representations of past experiments. He would wake with his pulse racing, heart pounding from the intensity of calculation, only to find that the patterns he had dreamed of contained insights he could apply to real-world problems. It was both a gift and a burden. The Institute had left a permanent mark on his cognition, amplifying his abilities while making rest and emotional relaxation a challenge. Julian's apartment was a reflection of his mind, organized, precise, and layered with hidden systems. Bookshelves were arranged by complex categorizations only he understood. His work desk contained stacks of notes, charts, and equations mapped in a way that made sense to no one but himself. Even his leisure activities, such as solving advanced puzzles, coding simulations, or playing strategy-based games, were extensions of his analytical mind. Yet within this order, there was also isolation, a careful separation from chaos, unpredictability, and emotional engagement that he had learned to associate with danger. Despite these challenges, Julian found moments of triumph and quiet satisfaction. His work saved companies from financial collapse, predicted market anomalies, and occasionally provided insights that seemed almost prophetic. In those moments, he felt the Institute's influence not as a burden, but as a tool refined through years of experience. He had transformed observation into mastery, scrutiny into skill, and pressure into innovation. Yet, beneath the accolades, he remained aware of the cost. An emotional life constrained, social interactions filtered through a lens of probability and caution, and a persistent, quiet longing for genuine human connection. He occasionally sought therapy, a methodical exploration of memory and emotion. Sessions were exercises in cognitive mapping, connecting past trauma to present behavior, identifying patterns of thought and habit developed under the Institute's watchful eye. These sessions were challenging, confronting decades of internalized vigilance and the habit of measuring oneself against an unseen observer. But Julian persisted, seeking balance between intellect and emotion, analysis and feeling, calculation and spontaneity. The most profound aspect of Julian's experience was the tension between genius and humanity. He could solve problems that others found insurmountable, yet he struggled with basic social dynamics. He could decode complex sequences, yet he could not always understand the subtleties of trust, intimacy, or vulnerability. The Institute had honed his mind to exceptional levels, but it had left the human heart largely untrained, requiring careful, conscious effort to navigate. Still, Julian persisted. He built routines to balance work, reflection, and connection. He found small communities of understanding. He cultivated moments of solitude that allowed him to reconcile his intellect with his emotions. In this equilibrium, he discovered a fragile sense of peace. The Institute's shadow remained, but he had learned to operate not merely as a product of it, but as a strategist of his own life, capable of shaping outcomes, nurturing talents, and cautiously exploring the human connections he had long deferred. In the quiet hours, Julian often reflected on the paradox of his existence: brilliance and burden, insight and isolation, mastery and longing. The Institute had shaped him, but it had not defined him. His life was an ongoing negotiation between the extraordinary abilities he possessed and the emotional landscapes he had yet to fully inhabit. And in that delicate, continuous balancing act, Julian discovered the essence of survival, adaptation, and the quiet triumph of human resilience. G12 had always moved through the world as if it were layered, some layers visible to others, some hidden deep within herself. From her earliest days in the Institute, she had been exceptional, a prodigy whose mind absorbed information with breathtaking speed, processed complex patterns, and anticipated events before they unfolded. But brilliance had been inseparable from surveillance, expectation, and control. She learned that her thoughts, her reactions, even her emotional impulses were all scrutinized, and from that awareness emerged both extraordinary insight and profound isolation. Now, in her late 20s, G12 lived in a quiet apartment filled with books, journals, and screens displaying streams of data, visualizations, and simulations. She had chosen a career in behavioral analytics, a field that allowed her to harness her ability to perceive subtle cues, predict outcomes, and understand motivations. Yet even in her professional environment, she remained reserved, aware that few could truly understand the depth of her perception. Colleagues saw efficiency, intellect, and composure. Few recognized the undercurrents of anxiety, hypervigilance, and self-doubt that accompanied every decision she made. Her personal life was fragmented, shaped by the Institute's long shadow. Relationships required calculation. Every word, every gesture, every expression analyzed for honesty, intent, and risk. Love had been rare, brief, and often abandoned out of fear that emotional vulnerability would render her exposed. Friends were chosen with care, their trust earned over long periods of observation and subtle testing. The human connection that most took for granted had always been a carefully negotiated domain for G12, where every interaction carried potential consequences she could not ignore. Despite this careful management, G12 found ways to reclaim agency. She had cultivated routines, personal rituals, and private mental exercises that allowed her to maintain autonomy over her mind. Meditation, journaling, and problem-solving became tools of both healing and mastery. She also explored art, music, and literature, not for social conformity, but as mediums to process emotion, explore empathy, and translate complex inner states into tangible form. These pursuits offered balance, moments where intellect and feeling could coexist without observation or judgment. Yet the Institute's imprint was persistent. Nightmares, intrusive thoughts, and flashes of memory returned with startling clarity. The meticulous recording, the evaluations, the relentless testing. These experiences sometimes resurfaced as internalized critiques, self-imposed pressures, and cycles of overthinking. G12 had learned to anticipate her own reactions, to preempt mistakes, to optimize behavior as if she were still being observed. This constant self-surveillance was both a strength and a burden, a coping mechanism that ensured excellence while undermining spontaneous connection and emotional ease. Her career, however, offered a measure of validation and purpose. G12 became known for her ability to detect subtle behavioral patterns, predict responses, and advise organizations on human dynamics with near-perfect accuracy. Colleagues relied on her insights, yet she remained enigmatic, her private world largely inaccessible. She had mastered influence without exposure, shaping outcomes through intellect rather than social convention. Each success reinforced her confidence, but also reminded her of the invisible chains she had carried for so long. In moments of solitude, G12 reflected deeply on the paradox of her life. Extraordinary cognitive abilities juxtaposed with persistent emotional fragility, independence achieved through vigilance, and relationships navigated through careful calculation. She understood that her brilliance was inseparable from the Institute's influence, yet she had also learned to repurpose it, transforming observation into intuition, surveillance into empathy, and control into choice. Personal growth was a slow, deliberate process. G12 began experimenting with vulnerability, allowing select individuals glimpses into her inner world. She tested trust carefully, observing not only behavior, but responses to openness, gauging authenticity and empathy. These experiments were both frightening and exhilarating, offering rare opportunities for connection while reminding her of the risks inherent in exposure. Every small success reinforced the notion that she could redefine herself, even as the echoes of her past persisted. One evening, as she walked through a quiet park, observing the movement of people and the rhythm of life, G12 recognized the duality that had defined her existence. She was both product and survivor of the Institute, shaped by brilliance and trauma alike. But in that recognition lay freedom. Freedom to choose her path, to cultivate relationships on her own terms, and to define the meaning of her intelligence and experience. She had learned to navigate not only patterns and probabilities, but also the complex landscapes of trust, empathy, and selfhood. The path forward was neither simple nor linear. G12 continued to wrestle with memory, emotion, and the pressure to excel, but she embraced the tension, recognizing it as both challenge and gift. Each day was an exercise in balance, intellect and feeling, observation and spontaneity, control and surrender. In this ongoing negotiation, she discovered resilience, agency, and the profound capacity to shape her own life. The Institute had attempted to define her, but she had rewritten the rules, and in that act of reclamation, G12 found not only survival, but purpose, mastery, and the beginning of genuine human connection. David Miller returned to the archives one final time, the weight of the past pressing on him with renewed intensity. The stories of the glass children, their brilliance, their resilience, and their suffering, had become more than data points or historical curiosities. They were living testimonies, intricately woven through decades of observation, trauma, and adaptation. Each child he had met, each account he had collected, revealed both extraordinary human potential and the profound cost of its cultivation under relentless scrutiny. Elena, with her strategic mind and meticulous routines, had transformed surveillance into mastery, but lived in careful isolation, navigating the world through a lattice of observation and calculation. Julian, a prodigy of numbers, could predict complex systems yet struggled to build trust and intimacy, balancing genius with a quiet longing for connection. G12 had reclaimed her mind and agency, mastering perception and behavioral insight, but continuously negotiated between brilliance and vulnerability, freedom and memory, intellect and emotion. Together, their experiences illuminated the spectrum of human endurance, creativity, and the ethical consequences of exploitation. David reflected on the paradox. These children had been shaped by a system that demanded excellence at the cost of normalcy, yet they had reclaimed themselves in extraordinary ways. The Institute had sought to observe, measure, and control, but in the process it had inadvertently produced resilience, ingenuity, and self-determination. Each survivor had navigated a unique path, negotiating the tension between brilliance and trauma, autonomy and imposed structure, observation and freedom. Their lives were testimonies not only to human potential, but to human tenacity. In quiet moments, he imagined the Institute's long corridors, the observation rooms, and the meticulous records. He thought of the children as they had once been, uncertain, anxious, brilliant, and trapped, and as they now were, adults negotiating the consequences of their past, carving out meaning, and seeking connection in a world unprepared for their minds. The journey through their lives had been both a historical excavation and a moral reckoning. David realized that to tell their story accurately required more than facts. It required empathy, nuance, and respect for their enduring humanity. He revisited the photographs, journals, and letters he had collected. Each image of a child at play, each note hidden in a desk drawer, each careful diagram of thought and observation represented more than the record of a system. They represented lives, struggles, triumphs, and the quiet courage of those who had survived extraordinary circumstances. David understood that the ultimate narrative was not about the Institute's ambitions, but about the individuals who had endured and transcended them. As he began to write the final chapters of his work, David reflected on the lessons of the glass children. He saw in their stories the duality of human potential, the capacity for extraordinary brilliance and the fragility that accompanies it, the power of observation and the necessity of empathy, the consequences of control and the triumph of autonomy. Their lives were mirrors, reflecting the best and worst of what structured ambition could produce, and in their resilience he found both inspiration and caution. The final pages of his notes detailed not only the facts of the past, but the ongoing journeys of the survivors. Some had achieved professional mastery, some had built quiet personal lives, and some continued to wrestle with memory, identity, and emotional connection. What united them all was endurance, the ability to navigate the shadow of the Institute and emerge as individuals capable of shaping their own destinies. Their brilliance had been forged under observation, but their humanity had been reclaimed through choice, adaptation, and perseverance. In the closing hours, David considered the story he would leave behind. It was not merely a chronicle of experiments or a catalogue of abilities. It was a testament to resilience, ingenuity, and moral complexity. The glass children had survived the pressures imposed upon them. They had endured, and they had thrived, each in their own way. Their stories carried both warning and admiration, illuminating the profound interplay between human intellect, emotion, and ethical responsibility. David left the archives, stepping into the fading light of a winter afternoon. The snow lay thick over the village, silent and undisturbed, a quiet witness to decades of hidden lives. He felt the weight of responsibility, but also a profound sense of closure. The glass children had been observed, measured, and in some ways controlled, yet their stories were now in his hands, preserved as living testimony. He understood that the narrative would endure, not as a tale of exploitation alone, but as a story of survival, brilliance, and the enduring capacity of the human spirit. In that moment, David saw the truth clearly. Shadows and light coexisted. In every life, brilliance and vulnerability intertwined, and the legacy of the glass children was not defined by the institute that had shaped them, but by the resilience, ingenuity, and humanity they had claimed for themselves. Their story, once hidden, would now stand as a testament to the complexity of human potential and the enduring power of choice, courage, and self-determination. And as he walked away from the archives, he felt certain that their lives, struggles, and triumphs would resonate far beyond the walls in which they had once been observed, a lasting reflection of the extraordinary, often painful, but ultimately human journey of the glass children.